Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. We have a very interesting and insightful presentation by Mercer today. I am Amanda De Palma, Vice President of Special Events for the Business Council of Westchester. Today we have joining us Mary Ann Sardone and Bill Rubich. A little insight first just into Mercer. Mercer is a partner of the BCW and a sponsor for today's event. Mercer brings strategic expertise to all things HR related, from health and benefits brokerage and program strategy, to workforce planning and HR transformation, to retirement and investment services. They offer thought leadership and consulting services that address all areas of human resource function. Mercer is part of the Marsh McLennan family of companies, which include Marsh, Guy, Carpenter, Oliver, and Weinman. Together, they serve customers in areas of risk, reassurance, business consulting, and human resources strategy. During this seminar, Mary Ann Sardone and Bill Rubich of Mercer will discuss how employers are responding and the methods they are using to drive workforce engagement and ensure the organization operates effectively while responding to new expectations and demands for flexibility. Mary Ann Sardone is a partner and East Market business leader for the career line of business within Mercer. With over 25 years of focused experience consulting in total reward strategy, compensation program design, and talent management, and broad human capital management, she currently leads Mercer's team of consultants and businesses in the Eastern US, covering executive and workforce rewards, talent strategy, HR transformation and change, workforce communications, and digital deployment of HR technology. Wow, Mary Ann, you're a busy lady there. Mary Ann's specific background includes the development of total reward strategies, global job evaluation approaches, domestic and global benchmarking, short and long-term incentive plans, design and integrated rewards, and talent management career frameworks. Her work spans across multiple industries, including consumer goods, automotive, manufacturing, and retail. Bill Rubich, senior principal based in Mercer's New York office, and has more than 30 plus years of experience in workforce communications, engagement, and culture development and change. Bill, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. You have extensive experience in assessing and developing HR policies and practices and in reviewing and develop employee policy handbooks. Recent work includes assessing and recommending policy adjustments for M&A transactions, assessing and adjusting car policies, and advising on the options for and implementing of flex remote work policies, both before COVID-19 pandemic and in light of the pandemic. Thank you both for being here and sharing all this information with us. I'll let you take it from here.
Great, thanks very much, Amanda. And good morning, everybody. We appreciate the opportunity to share Mercer's experience and the findings from our research. Flex remote and hybrid work is a red hot topic these days. Many organizations are eager to return to in-office work as more and more people get vaccinated, but many employees are still wary or uncertain about how they'll manage the work-life balance and issues such as childcare. We've divided today's discussion into three sections. We'll start with me reviewing the market trends our research has revealed and Mercer's insights on those trends. Mary Ann will then talk about the evolving definitions of flexibility and hybrid working and why definitions are needed. Then Mary Ann will conclude with a discussion about how organizations can sustain flexible working arrangements for the long term and at scale. I'll wrap with some summary observations, and then we've have time at the end set aside for questions. So let's dive into it. What does the research tell us about this topic? In a survey we conducted in February, which had 776 employers participating, they told us that they're generally planning a phased return to the office. In the graph here on the left, the percentages are the percentage of employers who expect to have 50% or more of their workforce back on site. 61% will be at 50% or more in Q3 this year, 81% will hit that level in Q4, and 91% will have 50% or more in the office in 2022. Now, shown on the right is how the fact that different employers are going to get to that on-site work in different ways. The smallest group at the bottom, 18%, will just set a date for being back in the office, and that's the date they're supposed to be in. There's no phase-in period. And as you can see, this is definitely not the most common approach. Instead, moving up, 27% will have a phase-in, and they'll let the individual employees decide how they phase in, how frequently they come back into the office. The other two groups are divided into the percentage who will have a phase-in using 3 to 4 days back in the office to start, and another largest group who will start by phasing in with 1 to 2 days back in the office. Regardless of how they'll get there, the most important thing to note about this data is that the percentages below the arrow at left are percentages of employers who expect 50% or more of their employees back in the office. It's not everybody back in the office. And with almost 10% on the right thinking that they will not have 50% or more back by 2022, it's clear that flex and remote work will still be with us and still be an issue to manage for some time. So the data on this slide confirm that conclusion, but they do it a bit more directly in terms of what employers are doing. 97%, almost everybody responding to our April survey, said that they plan to make changes to their flexible working approach post-pandemic. Now, I want to point out about this survey shown on the right here. We know that many members of the BCW are with smaller organizations. So lest you be concerned about the validity of this data, I'd point out that more than 1/3 of the participants in our survey with these results were organizations with fewer than 500 full-time employees. So this is not data from jumbo employers entirely. The arrow in the center here shows where organizations are in making their plans for flex work. Matching the 97% who say they are planning, we have 3% who say they have no plans to increase flex. So the math works so far there. For those planning to increase flexibility, the vast majority, the second tier from the top, 48%, are actively developing their strategy now. 23% feel they already have the strategy developed and they're at the implementation phase, while 26% are still evaluating the need and making plans. So the question is, why are organizations looking to adopt flexibility at scale? And we have the top reasons here. I'd say that there are 4 of them are the top reasons, and the last, which I'll point out, is a driver but not a driving reason. The biggest reason driving the adoption of flexibility is a desire to enhance the employee value proposition. 76 say this is a top priority, and the key reason is that the feedback from employees. In one of our surveys, which we'll touch on in one of the following slides, nearly 60% of employees said they would consider leaving their current employer if flexibility is not maintained after the pandemic. Nearly 60%. So that's a great motivator. We also see at 67%, the second most important factor is the ability to improve engagement and performance through increased flexibility. A Stanford study found, looking at call center employees, that those working remotely were measurably more productive, satisfied, and less likely to quit. Working down the reasons for adopting a more flexible approach, 58% noted that it makes it much easier for them to expand their talent pool options. Basically, if you don't require people to be in the office, you can hire talent that isn't local, and this gives you the ability to get the best talent. And frankly, this can also help increase the diversity of your workforce if you're not just recruiting from a local pool. Sustainability, basically reducing pollution and global warming greenhouse gases by not having people commute in, is also a motivator. This is frankly something that we've found in our research gets a lot of traction with the younger employees who want to work with an organization that is committed to sustainability. The final item here shows you that fewer than a third of organizations say that the cost reductions are a driver in adopting flexible work. And that may seem a bit surprising given the state of the economy, but what we're hearing is that organizations are really playing the long game. Cost considerations are not a primary driver, but they are a positive outcome. So in a summary, what they're doing is optimizing around what's right for the business first, as opposed to leading with real estate decisions. But of course, organizations are considering this as a key element of their strategy, and we'll continue to see that play out in the future, given the longer term nature of real estate holdings. So on the previous slide, I noted that in one of our surveys, nearly 60% of employees in that survey said that they would consider leaving their current job if flexibility was no longer offered after the pandemic. The actual number was 56%. That was in a values survey that Mercer did with our client AECOM. Now, I see it noted in the footnote. Other points we got on that survey were 38% were saying it was somewhat important as opposed to very important. And we did have a portion, 6%, who said having flexibility post-pandemic was not a priority for them. Even though we've got that small 6%, the vast majority are saying flex is a high priority. And it's worth noting that it's even more important as a priority for younger Gen X and millennial employees than it is for older members of the workforce. And another significant thing we've seen, not only in our research, but other studies, here's a Chamber of Commerce observation at the right, flexible hours and remote work are rated as the most important employer-provided benefits for working parents. So we're seeing interest from employers in having more flex and remote work options. We're seeing employees also driving this. So both of these are really driven by the fact that we just went through a forced experiment, having to adopt them because of the pandemic. So we're moving forward into this world of flex work. There's pressure on both ends to do this. But as we do this, we have to be mindful of what impact this may have on the workforce. And looking at other research that Mercer did in the past, historically, we've looked at what the impact work arrangements other than full-time in-office work have had on the employees and the organization. And we've studied turnover, advancement, performance ratings, and employee engagement. In one of our case studies shown on the graph below, this is actually with our parent company, Marsh McLennan, we looked at part-time employees and employees who worked remotely. As you can see in the graph, for part-timers, and by the way, you could see the part-timers as a proxy for people working on a reduced hours or flexible schedule, we definitely saw higher turnover, a lower promotion rate, lower performance ratings, and lower engagement than you saw for full-time employees. But if we look at remote workers, while we still have higher turnover and a lower promotion rate, though not as badly as for part-timers, the interesting thing was we had higher performance ratings for remote workers and a much higher level of engagement for remote workers than for in-office workers. So the bottom line here is, while the majority of organizations are moving forward to adopt flex work and remote work and have those policies in place, as we do this, it's going to be important to keep monitoring this data and the impact on the workforce so that we don't get surprised by unintended consequences of adopting a flex and remote work approach. So now I'm going to hand it off to Mary Ann to talk about how flexibility and hybrid working can be defined. Mary Ann?
All right, thanks, Bill. A lot of great information, and we've done a lot of research over the last year, and we continue to research this topic because it is top of mind for all of you and many of our clients. So when we ventured into helping define flexibility, which actually started prior to the pandemic, we acknowledge that flexibility really comes in many forms, and different jobs have flexibility through different dimensions. Certain roles and industries have adopted forms of flexibility more than others. So, despite this great experiment we've been in this last year on where work gets done, we see that flexibility can also be found in when one works, how or the pace and scale of work, what actually people do, for example, concentrating certain tasks with one person or a few people, or who actually does the work. Is it a full-time employee? Is it a gig worker, a part-time worker, or is the work actually automated? So at Mercer, we believe it's about far more than remote working, and we recognize that through these five dimensions. And so we think it's critically important that employers consider this multidimensional view now, because we're taking this intentional approach. Uh-oh, I think our slides are moving. There we go. Okay.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, let's go back to the people.
Sorry, Marianne.
Okay, are we good? Okay, good. So, we were talking about the need for employers to take this multidimensional approach, because, the reality is in most organization, not all jobs can flex on location. I think we've experienced that now with our essential workers. And you have this potential to create the haves and have-nots in your organization where not everyone has the opportunity to flex. By analyzing the work itself, we think it's key to defining the flexible working program going forward and long term. And at the end of the day, having that work help be the guide and the baseline to flexibility is really emerging as a best practice. So if we could go to the next slide, let's look at these forms of flexibility and the market data that we collected on that. We see that flexibility is increasing across these multiple dimensions due to COVID. And these examples here of different types of flexible working arrangements that we kind of bundle in these five dimensions, we note are all sort of increasing at different rates, of course. And organizations don't plan to take some of this flexibility back, except we think for some moderate retraction of remote working. So by and large, flexible working will persist, especially as it relates to where and when work gets done. But you can also see a fairly sizable increase in part-time arrangements as well, as this idea of internal marketplaces is emerging where people can move around internally for different gigs or projects that are assigned based on their skill sets. So if we dig in a little further on the next slide, Bill, we can talk about how we look at particular roles and examine that work. So if you could see in this example, a sales professional category, we would dig into all of these dimensions and ask questions, particularly if we think about the dimension of where, of how it really impacts the productivity of the role. What are the location requirements of the role? Customer expectations? What's the visibility of job outcomes? Is that important? Or is that something that you don't actually have to see a person to see the job outcome? What's the impact of face-to-face collaboration? Does location have an impact on the quality of work? What kind of security considerations do we have to think about with somebody not being in a company-sponsored location? So all of these things get us closer to understanding the role's capacity to flex. And we think that taking this approach really helps organizations create that baseline flexible model. If we go to the next slide, that being said, companies right now are responding to this experience of the last year around flexing where individuals work. And the vast majority are landing on this hybrid model. So you can see from this continuum, we go from kind of a predominantly office-based model where we are finding about 19% of organizations are putting themselves, a distributed model, which is maybe more of a hub model, which is what we are seeing Facebook adopt, a hybrid model, which again allows for some flexing on days in the office, days remote. And then this remote first model, an example of that is Dropbox. I think Twitter and several tech companies are adopting that remote first. Not all tech companies, by the way. So, we have everything in between, but that hybrid model is really emerging as the one where people are settling and companies are settling. But I do think there's going to be a lot of testing and recalibrating once everyone sort of is past the pandemic related restrictions that I think we're all still feeling. If we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about how we approach this work. I'm heavily involved in the development of how we work with clients in this space. And we find that, again, starting with the work itself really gives us a strong basis for assessment. And everyone understands that, right? If we really look at the work, our customers, internal and external, what do we need to actually do? And how does it lend itself to flexibility? And that's a very objective assessment when you look at those questions we would ask. At the same time, we need to understand the context. So what are the leader objectives? What are their preconceived notions? And I think all of us have evolved a bit in this last year. So those things have changed. Employee preferences have changed over the last year and they continue to morph. So really understanding what flexibility is desirable in your organization, given your culture, is super important. And those two things together help you define the flexibility really of the future. And we think about that through those dimensions. So is it going to be flexibility only on where people work? Or will it be flexibility on when they work or how they work? Or, will we provide a little bit more part-time arrangements? So all those things kind of help shape that flexible working program going forward. We think also personifying it through real people and real jobs and helping them understand, what does it mean for this type of work? What does it mean for that type of work? And clearly setting boundaries. Boundaries are important because they give people the guardrails they need to operate. Managers, leaders won't have everything scripted for them, but if they understand the boundaries of where you're able to go and not go, then it makes it easier to operate. Finally, sustaining the change is where I think a lot of the energy is going to be. As soon as we sort of get back to some kind of flexible working program, sustaining that change is critically important because there are compliance and governance and change in communication, all these things that need to happen over an extended period of time to ensure whatever program you put in place is sustainable. And there's infrastructure, like setting people up, are you going to have, reimbursements from working from home? Where do you cut that off? How much are you going to provide given that everybody has been operating in that environment? And then the people programs themselves, how are we going to manage performance when we don't always see people? How are we going to ensure some of the things that Bill said about the outcomes like advancement and engagement? How are we going to make sure we can maintain that and we don't have a disparate impact for certain groups that are maybe working in a more flexible arrangement? So all these things are pretty important. If we go to the next slide, Bill, talking a little more deeply about sustaining flexibility at scale, there are some priorities that are emerging as we survey our clients. Really creating a supportive culture is at the top of the list. Culture continues to emerge, and I don't think it's about a goal of ensuring that the culture remains exactly the same as it was. We've all changed. Life has changed. The world's changed around us. But it's about maintaining that secret sauce of what made the organization unique, as well as identifying the cultural tenets that you may want to improve or change, because cultures are a living, breathing thing, and they need to evolve over time. It's also important that you revamp things like onboarding. I'm personally experiencing this as we are hiring a lot of people at Mercer, and how we onboard people has to be rethought. I can't welcome somebody in the door and shake their hand and talk to them. I have to engage them in a different way. I think most organizations are dealing with that now longer term, knowing I may not always be face to face with the people that I'm hiring. A comprehensive change strategy, as I mentioned, is so important. And that has to also include continually listening to the workforce and course correcting over time, because nobody has this perfected. No company that we note in the media knows for sure if it's all going to work perfectly the way they planned it. So continually adjusting your plans, having that trust and open dialogue with your workforce to say, we may need to switch gears a little bit. But I think everybody understands that that's been the case in the last year. And I think a lot of organizations have invested in that. And then I think there's some opportunities to align with DE&I goals because, as we all know, DE&I is increasingly part of the conversation. And we know that women and minorities can be positively impacted through flexible options. But this needs to be balanced with leaders modeling flexible behavior. And it does an organization little good if they create a strong, flexible working program and then leaders go back to kind of prior ways of working with an office presence that's required. Okay, let's keep going and double down on this leader discussion because we think it's really plays a critical role in executing on the vision. As I mentioned, leaders have to drive the right behaviors. If you're going to have a longer term flexible working strategy and program, leaders have to walk the talk. This means getting all the leaders aligned and in support of the new strategy, but also, like I said, modeling what your flexibility looks like in your company. As organizations roll out these strategies, if leaders continue this office bound behavior, they send this message that office work is the way forward. This has a potential of creating bias, as I mentioned. So leadership modeling is important, but it has to be authentic and representative of what your company wants to do. We do have companies, I think we had the 17% that said, no, we want people back in the office. If that's clearly what you need and want as an organization, that should be clearly what you convey, rather than conveying a flexible working strategy and then actually modeling behaviors that say, I really want everybody back in the office. And of course, managers play a huge role in empowering the trust and confidence, because at the end of the day, what we're finding is it all starts and stops with the manager. They're the ones that are driving the productivity and the engagement of the workforce, and they play a critical role because they're there to assess performance and engagement and productivity. So they have to, we have to empower our managers to make the right decisions and train them to work in this new environment. And I think finally, creating that compelling employee experience is always top of mind for all of us. But it's important that it is through consistent and equitable application across the organization. So some individuals may have a different interpretation of flexibility. Again, those boundaries and guardrails will help us understand what's possible and what's not. Oh, I think we flipped. Yeah, I'll just finish that. So anyway, a lack of consistent and equitable application sometimes really hurts us. So we have to make sure there are some consistent decisions. We have to check ourselves on that. Okay, so let's talk about a case. This is a client that we support. I think we're still actually supporting on their post-pandemic flexible working strategy. In this example, the challenge was there was little to no flexibility in the work model prior to the pandemic. So through this last year and experience, they realized, we need something longer term. We use the approach of looking at the work to help define the flexibility for the roles. We helped reimagine the role of the office post-pandemic and assess the sustainability of the model going forward. So here you can see they define flexibility through these three dimensions of where, when, and how we work. And to the right, you can see that they several different models emerged from on-site flexibility that they anticipate about 20% of their workforce would adopt, very consistent with our survey data. Primary on-site, about 40%. This other form of hybrid around connected remote. So they're connected, but they're remote at 35%. And then fully remote around 5%, which is actually not that different than probably a lot of organizations pre-pandemic, that 5%. They created some personas around, what that looks like and the example jobs that might fit into those categories. So again, different forms of flexibility. Not everyone has the same opportunity to flex, but providing different dimensions of flexibility gives a little bit more flexibility for all. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Bill to maybe talk about some actions we can take, and then maybe we can have some time for some Q&A, or we can go back to some of the content.
Yeah, and thanks, Marianne. And we're doing great on time, frankly. So that's good news. We have lots of time to have questions and discussion. But let's summarize this. We've shared a lot of information. Let's try to emphasize 5 practical actions you can take to build your flexible model in a sustainable way. First, it's really important to start shaping your strategy now, but as you do that, it's critical that you communicate with your employees about where you are. This is important because employees are really looking for guidance. There's been a lot of uncertainty around the pandemic. We've all done flex work because of the pandemic in many improvisational ways. And so employees are now, as we get back to normal, they're wondering, well, what is it actually going to be like? And how is it going to fit with me? So try to make sure that you're letting your employees know what's developing, even if you haven't finalized things, just communicating that you're working on it, that you recognize the importance and that you're addressing it. That's a critical change step. Second, as you shape your strategy, explore ways to provide flexibility for everybody, such as flexible scheduling and part-time arrangements. In the case study Marianne was just talking about, you saw that we found that even across different types of jobs and different requirements to be on site versus not, you could still offer some flexibility to the people who are going to be on site. And what that's helpful at doing is making sure that it can be part of your value proposition for all your employees, not just office-based employees or knowledge workers. Next, as you examine the work to understand how the flexibility impacts different roles, you want to engage both your leaders and your employees to understand their needs, attitudes, and priorities, and align these appropriately to identify the optimal flexibility options. Fourth, again, in earlier slides, we talked about the infrastructure. You need a strong foundation. You need to think about your policies, what risks you need to manage, what's required for compliance, and your governance structure so that you've got a model to manage the new program clearly. And again, of course, you've got to make sure that all of those things, the procedures and the policies, are clearly communicated to all employees. Last, you want to think about the infrastructure and the people programs and assess and prioritize what changes are needed. So again, we've covered a lot. There is more information that we'll share with you after this session. We're going to be providing a link to the PDF of the deck, and we'll also include a white paper that we did recently, The New Shape of Work is Flexibility for All. And we can also share the highlights of our most recent Flex Work survey that was just conducted at the end of March and early April. So we'll make all of that information available. But I know we've shared a lot of info so far, so we're hoping that at this point, maybe we've got some questions we can answer and chat with you about.
Yeah, I think there might be a question here. Maybe I'll read it, and then, Bill, you and I can take it. I see from Tracy, what are the most effective strategies, tactics you've seen in keeping remote employees engaged? For example, what's not working?
Critical.
What's working, what's not working? Good question. I think we're all trying to learn those strategies and wonder, do we need to maintain these strategies? Is it going to be the same volume of people working remotely? But I think what it's provided is an opportunity for more engagement and communication with people. I think we often, when we were in sort of an office environment, relied on the informal sort of hello, assuming people were okay. And I think really more intentional time, one-on-one time, more broad kind of leadership discussions with a larger group of people in a more frequent basis has helped with engagement. I work with an organization, and the leader said, I've been able to reach more people more frequently in this environment than I ever did before. And so I do
Mhm.
think just more often connecting and connecting one-on-one with people, because, if you can imagine, if somebody was in another office and you wanted to connect one-on-one, you often just needed to be there in person. But now through Zoom, no matter, I know we don't all love it sometimes, but I'm able to look at your face and you're able to see me, and I can see the environment you're in and what else is going on in your life. So I think it allows people to really connect on another level than they did before. Bill, any
Right.
other questions? I mean, any other answers to that?
No, I think it's good. The one thing I would point out is the interesting thing. If you remember, we talked about that case study we did with our parent company MMC, which looked at the impact of part-time work and also remote work, and this was pre-pandemic.
Mhm.
And the interesting thing in that study was that the people who were working remote had a higher level of engagement than the regular people in the office. So in many, and I think what could have accounted for that is that remote work was not as common. So those people were making a special effort. But in some ways, the fact that people are reaching out because they know they have to reach out and scheduling time and talking, that may mean that the engagement for the remote workers is not as critical. I think the critical thing to think about for the remote workers is not their individual engagement, but bringing the team together. And again, we've done that with a lot of virtual socializing. It does sound, the Zoom happy hour is a bit of a cliche, but frankly, it can be really nice to just see people together. And similar things we've done about celebrating people's retirements, or I was just participated last week in a virtual baby shower. And frankly, it was one of the most fun things I've done in the past year.
Great. I think we continue to have another question about creating engaging atmosphere and opportunities for collaboration when employees have little or no face-to-face interaction other than virtual events. Now, it's an interesting question because I do think companies are starting to think about post-pandemic life, right? And so we've been working under this assumption that we're always going to be sort of virtual, or we can't be face to face. I think now, I mean, I live in Atlanta, Georgia. And so, things have opened up more quickly down here than in other parts of the country. So I'm a little bit sort of more post-pandemic than most. But I think companies are thinking about the purpose of the office becoming that place, right, for intentional collaboration. So we do want people to be face to face. We're not going to ask them to come into an office just to put their heads down and work. We're going to ask them to come into the office to collaborate, to come together, to celebrate. Some organizations are saying the purpose of the office is about celebrating, collaborating, and being creative together, not getting our work done on a day-to-day basis. They don't want people coming in and just being on Zoom calls, right? So I think you have to think about more face-to-face interaction in a hybrid working model. So face-to-face for some things, but then working in a traditional sense where it's an individual putting kind of productive time in. Maybe that's where they don't really actually have to be together with anybody else. Does that help?
Yep. And Marianne, I'd add to that that even if you're not just looking at the office, there are other things you can do. And frankly, it overlaps with some of the DEI work we're doing.
Mhm.
One of the things we've seen some organizations do, and we've done it ourselves, is recognizing that people don't have the by chance meetings with people. And so we've intentionally, leadership has said, we're going to take people who are in the same office virtually and say, hey, we're going to have a session where we're going to tell you 5 people who work in different areas and different groups and may not have met. We're just going to have a meeting where we're going to bring you 5 together to just chat. And we may set you a task or ask you to particularly do something. And it's a way of forcing an interaction that can happen virtually that then may lead further. The related idea is to think about how you're staffing and assigning projects. And frankly, this is a classic issue with DEI and addressing favoritism, is for managers and leaders to think about who they're putting on projects, and challenge themselves to say, let me bring in people, not the people I always work with that I know are my A team, but let me expand it to people I don't usually work with, but may well help with that. And that introduces them to a bigger pool of people and definitely can support DEI and also can help you avoid complaints of favoritism.
Yeah. All right. So I think there's a request for if there's any additional research. Did I see that right? Oh, wait. I think it's moved down really quickly. Hold on.
Very small.
Surveys for very small businesses. Ooh, that's tough. I'm not sure. Direction of our staff is extremely time consuming when remote compared to in person when it has been more organic, casual process. Look, I think at the end of the day, every company needs to do what works for their business and the work that's getting done. Now, there is a competitive market that's emerging around flexibility. So I think that's a reality of the competition in your value proposition that that employees want some level of flexibility. So I think figuring out how you provide what flexibility is possible for your business, but at the same time, you've got to stay true to your business. Like, if you have to have somebody in person to do the work, you don't change that, right? So I think getting back to understanding the work itself and saying what do we really have that's possible here, because the market's kind of forcing our hand a little bit, but I also think at the end of the day the work itself has to guide how much flexibility you provide.
One thing you might look at there for a model, first, you may have already been doing things in your group like having a daily huddle, or maybe even having more than one daily huddle for the team, or looking at technology where it's sort of instant communication for collaboration, things such as Slack. And it might be instructive to look at some very small startup organizations, basically when you've got an IT product group that's saying you've got, a handful of people who've come up with an idea and they're trying to launch it. Unfortunately, this is maybe harder if you're not, a young high-tech group already, but those groups may provide good examples, and we can look and see if we have any articles or data we could share on that. The next question is, in your research, were there any additional opportunities that would suggest leadership traits, behaviors needed to shift to embrace this new way of work? Marianne, I don't know if you've seen the recent leadership, the 4 characteristics of leadership traits needed for the future that David and others just came out with. One of our colleagues, particularly David Jackson, who is a C-suite level leadership development consultant, has recently released something. And since I'm screen sharing, I'm wary of trying to get to that and bring it up, but I'll look and see if we can share that, because I do believe this touches on that issue.
Yeah, I think that would be good. But, just off the cuff on that, I think that leadership traits and behaviors, what we found in talking to companies is this last year helped us identify the leaders in that critical time during COVID, and those that were leaders that maybe shouldn't be leaders. So these traits were emerging, and some people stepped up to the game and some people didn't. And I think that it's really coming down to strong leadership and management behaviors, which is going to make this sustainable. Because, this new way of working requires that somebody be very open-minded and agile, right? That kind of mindset is just absolutely critical right now. If you want to go back to the way it was and you're a leader and says that's the way it's going to be, doesn't really reflect on a mindset of agility. So I can tell you that one's probably at the top of the list. Okay.
And I'd also, one other thing, I don't know if we've seen another question, but on that leadership thing, if you're going to have a flex program, it's important to make sure that you see some of your leaders, senior leadership, using the flex and working remotely. That way they're modeling that it's approved. If you say we have flex, but then all of your workforce recognizes that, I look at the whole C-suite or the leadership team and they're in the office every day, the message you're sending is that unless you're in the office, you're not going to be able to rise to that level.
Yeah. Amanda, are we out of time, or do we have any other questions that you're seeing somewhere else?
So I did not see any other questions
Okay.
come in. Thank you both for sharing all this with us. I think everybody is, in that transitional time right now, and everyone's trying to figure out what works best for their organizations and for them individually. So I'm sure this will sort of be an ever evolving topic as we, really get back into business and coming into the office or still working from home. So thank you both. Thank you both again.
I think there's another page, Bill, where we're going to share some of our thought leadership. If you go to the next slide, where maybe Amanda, you can help us get that out to everybody. Our white paper on the new shape of work, it touches on some of the content that I was talking about, and then some highlights from our recent Flex survey. So I think both of those we can make available to the group.
Absolutely, absolutely. The entire presentation will be posted on the BCW's Facebook page. It'll also be posted on our Resource Center and YouTube page, and everyone that was tuned in today will receive the link. And of course, we can send them, this content as well. So absolutely, we can share with everyone.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks for everybody's time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again. We'll see you at the next one.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.